In this video, I'm going to address some practical ways in which we can strengthen that weak hand. This will follow on somewhat from the video I did recently on developing the fulcrum, and I would suggest you watch that one first if you haven't already, because that will be a good primer for what we're going to be focusing on today. Now, this is going to be a much more practically minded video, so I'm going to do a little bit of explanation and discussion first, and then I'm simply going to run through a number of exercises with the notation on the screen that I believe are the most helpful. Now, at the beginning of the video, you saw me performing a piece entitled Weak Hand Study 1, which I've got on my music stand here, and it is from the snare drum Virtuoso. Unsurprisingly, as the title suggests, this is a study dedicated to developing that weak hand. So many of the exercises that I'm going to demonstrate today are taken from figures within that study. So for people who are really keen to develop their technique generally and that weak hand especially, that might be a good place to start. You can download a free sample on my website. Now, the things I'm going to be discussing today are primarily to do with movement, primarily to do with the strength in the fulcrum, the strength in the fingers, the strength in the wrist, and the motions that our hands perform. Now, perhaps like me, you come from a drum kit background, or perhaps you specialize on the snare drum, but either way, you will tend to find that your stronger hand will perform motions much more confidently than your weaker hand. If you are a drum kit player, you will find that on the hi-hat, your hand will move in a certain way. We'll have this nice flowing whipping motion on the wrist. We might find if we're playing over here on the ride cymbal, we're adopting a French position with the thumb on top. The fingers are engaging for every stroke, but there's a lot more motion happening in the wrist. Generally speaking, that left hand on a drum kit is not called upon to perform those same sorts of motions. And this has the knock-on effect of meaning it never develops the same sort of strength that is required to perform those motions. If you are not a drum kit player, if you are specifically a snare drum player, this might be less pronounced, but nevertheless, we will find that that left hand is still weaker at performing certain motions. Now, all of the exercises today are going to be based around the voicing of accents within complex figures. And this is intentional. This is because we need to differentiate in our hand and in our motions between unaccented strokes, which are generally performed with the fingers, and accented strokes, which are performed by a whipping motion of the wrist and a snapping shut of the fingers. You can see there's a wind up, the fingers open at the top, and then they snap closed as we whip. Now that in and of itself requires a degree of strength on the fulcrum, because if we don't have that strong fulcrum, that stick just flies out of the hand. We risk dropping it, or at best, it just loses position in the hand and we lose control of the stick. So, everything we're going to be doing today revolves around producing an accent and a certain number of unaccented strokes. So a nice primer here, a nice way to warm up on this is a simple accent tap motion that just gets us into the right frame of mind and starts developing the motion that we're looking for. Now, because of the strength of the accent and the amount of energy coming through the wrist, coming through the stick, as I've said, it requires that fulcrum to be strong. If it's not strong, we're going to drop the stick, we're going to lose the control of the fingers. It is also worth noting that these figures are different depending on whether we begin with the accent or end with the accent. If we take one of the figures that has 2 unaccented strokes, when we begin with the accent, those 2 accented strokes essentially become controlled bounces. We are performing the whipping motion that produces energy, that produces momentum in the stick, and we use our fingers simply to control that rebound. When we begin with the unaccented double strokes and we have to produce the accent ourselves, that requires a slightly different movement, at least in the beginning, because we need to do the bounces first, and then we need to snap out, bring the wrist up, and snap those fingers closed again. By having the accent at the end, it really forces us to produce that accent in a strong way. You can see this motion starting to happen in my wrist here, this up motion preparing for the snap of the accent. Now, we will tend to find that that is already strongly developed in our strong hand. This is the sort of thing that we need to develop in our weak hand. I'm repeating myself now, but this will simultaneously strengthen the fulcrum, cause the fingers to engage, and increase our overall strength in producing that stroke. Now, just finally, before I get onto the exercises themselves, when I talk about strength, I am not necessarily talking about athletic strength, the sort of strength that you can just go and lift weights for. This is a strength that is born of control. It is a strength born of confidence, of knowing, in a physiological sense, where those fingers need to be, where that stick needs to be, and how the muscles need to react. It's a sort of strength born from confidence and control, as I say. So this is not necessarily something that you can just go away and use one of those grip workouts for. That might help in its own sort of way, but what we are really trying to do here is build strength with our control of the motions. So, without further ado, here are a selection of exercises that all work on this principle of accents and unaccented strokes, and for your own reference, these are all taken from weekend study number 1 from the Snare drum Virtuoso. So that selection of exercises represents a small section of figures that we can practice that work our hand in a certain way. Now, even in just doing those demonstrations then, my hand is warm. My hands are buzzing a little bit. I can feel the blood flowing. It feels like I've just done some exercise because my left hand, despite all of the practice that I've done, and many of you will have done as well, that left hand is just never quite called upon to work in the same way as the right hand. You often find an incredibly strong dominant hand bias, which for most intents and purposes is the right hand. Look at any drum solo transcription you may have. It's going to begin with the right hand almost certainly. Everything is right hand based. Everything perpetuates the strength of your dominant hand, and that left hand is just left behind, pun intended. We are never, or we are very unlikely to be able to bring that weak hand to parity with the right hand. At least not in a true sense. Now, over the course of a career, we might develop it to the point where it's no longer an issue, which would be wonderful for all of us. But the purpose of these exercises is to strengthen the motions, to get that hand working and moving in a way with which it is unfamiliar. Now, one final closing point, which I think is very useful to many of you, and certainly been useful to me, is to practice these exercises and figures in multiple ways. I talked about this in the developing the fulcrum video. For me, this is my normal grip. The thumb is on the inside, so in a matched grip, the thumbs are facing each other. The thumbnails are facing each other. So from this position, that's the most comfortable way for me to play. Now I can practice this by removing the index finger, forcing my thumb to engage more strongly with the middle finger. That's certainly a difficult one, especially with the stronger accent patterns, because that thumb and middle finger are just going to be less developed than a more front-based grip. So So doing that with the index finger off the stick just feels like I'm handicapping myself. It's like trying to run with my legs tied together, but that demonstrates a weakness. We can follow this same principle in French position with the thumb on top. Whether or not you actually play with this grip, this will again really help to strengthen the fulcrum, strengthen the engagement of the fingers, and get that hand moving as confidently as the right. So first of all, with the index finger fulcrum, I'm using the triplet exercise, by the way, triplet and, because I think that's one of the best ones to develop the unaccented strokes as well as the accent. And remove the index finger. Now you can probably see there that that's just a lot more clumsy, and that thumb and middle finger are really having to work hard to keep the stick in position, but that's entirely the point. So for myself, I will often run through the weak hand study in all 4 positions. In this position, index finger grip, middle finger grip. In French position, index finger grip, middle finger grip, just to try and gradually strengthen the motions, gradually strengthen the fulcrum. So I hope this has been useful to you. Please do bear in mind that this is not a quick fix. This will take time. These are conditioners. As I said, you wouldn't necessarily do a number of press-ups and then expect to be stronger there and then on the day. You would have to do them regularly, frequently, over a longer period of time, and gradually you will build up your strength. You will build up your facility with that weaker hand with regards to drumming. So as I say, I hope this has been useful. Let me know how you get on with this, and I very much hope to see you on the next video. Thank you very much.